listener production.
Hey, Chris Spyrou with you, and welcome to the first ever episode of The Briefing for 2026. Now, it's been 9.5 years since we were first introduced to a little town called Hawkins. Its drunk police chief, a short-haired girl who can move things with her mind, and words like demogorgon. And if none of that's ringing a bell, here's a little something to get you up to speed.
Something is coming. Something hungry for blood. What is it? The Demogorgon!
We're in deep shit.
Yes, strap in because we are talking Stranger Things. After nearly a decade, 5 seasons, and around 50 hours spent on our screens, the last ever episode drops today. And don't you worry, there are absolutely no spoilers here other than the fact that Hopper dies. I'm kidding, I haven't watched it. Anyway, I've gathered you all here today on the first day of the year to unpack something that I learned that blew my mind. The show is rumoured to be based on an old government conspiracy theory, so much so that its creators had initially named the show after it.
The title, Stranger Things, because it was originally called Montauk for the longest time.
Yes, Montauk. A little village at the end of Long Island in New York that researcher and award-winning filmmaker Christopher Garetano knows all too well. And he joins us now all the way from Florida in the States. Christopher, welcome to The Briefing. You've worked on and made multiple documentaries and series about this little corner of Long Island. You made your own film. You've worked with the History Channel, Discovery Channel. Theories aside, what can you tell us about Montauk?
On record, the town of Montauk, New York, which is the very furthest eastern tip of Long Island. So at the very edge, you have a place called Montauk Point, and it's the Atlantic Ocean. So it has a vast history, and that history spans from the Revolutionary War, where they would stockpile weapons out there in that location, to was a place of quarantine just after the Spanish-American War, and Roosevelt and all the Rough Riders went down there, and I think mainly for quarantine in the same area. It was always a place of interest. Montauk Point has vast cliffs, not too dissimilar from certain cliffs overlooking the ocean, Pacific Ocean in California. So it feeds into some of the more esoteric allure that surrounds the area, if it's not just historical fact, where we do have an Air Force station around World War II. The Camp Hero area, Fort Hero, became the Camp Hero Air Force Station. And that is where eventually that radar tower, that iconic SAGE semi-automatic ground environment radar tower, is still standing. It was a location of defense, allegedly, to defend ourselves if the Nazi attack or anybody else was coming during World War II. That was just a station for defense. They were disguised as a fishing village, so there was always some mysterious aspects to it because they were lying to the locals and saying, oh, we're just a village of fishermen, which it wasn't. It was a secret military location. And at that time also, it's quite remote. In the summertime now, that location in Montauk it's a happening place. There are bands and restaurants, resorts, beaches, beautiful beaches. But 5 miles from town, way up the hill towards Montauk Point, there is forest area, and there is a location at the edge of the cliffs where Camp Hero rests still.
And as I understand it, it also got some use during the Cold War to track Russian planes. Now, the next date I've got here is 1992, when a man named Preston Nichols published a book called The Montauk Project, Experiments in Time. What can you tell us about some of the key claims in that book?
Okay, so rewinding back a little bit, I remember the book. I read the book. It was very thin. What Preston Nichols said was, roughly between 1971 and 1983, there were secret experiments that occurred deep beneath the surface of the Camp Hero Air Force Station. Now, in his book, he claimed that there was everything from mind control experiments, time travel experiments, reverse engineering of alien technology or extraterrestrial technology. And that all occurred, but it seemed like it was framed in that little book as a science fiction adventure story. And I think that was their intention too. What they left out in that very first volume was most of what came out later and what I was interested in, and what to me was tantamount into projects that were proven was the experimentation on undesirables. So in other words, there were programs and experiments that were proven, everything from MK Ultra to the Tuskegee medical experiments to the Holmesburg prison experiments or experiments in orphanages that have all been proven as fact. And that the things that Preston Nichols and these gentlemen talked about were there allegedly were runaway kids around the New York and Long Island area that were recruited and brought into these experiments because nobody would miss them. And that is the story that Nichols and friends were telling later. It wasn't really in that first book. It was alluded to slightly, but all framed in that science fiction adventure story, which Stranger Things eventually, I think, took a lot of those elements and melded it into their story, yet they didn't completely shy away from the kidnapping and the experiments.
Is this something that you grew up knowing? Is this a conspiracy theory or a theory, or the chatter around Montauk? Is that something that a lot of New Yorkers are aware of and discuss openly?
Now it is. But the Montauk Project story, it was in whispers. It didn't really become a popular piece of folklore until later, until after my movie came out. And of course, Stranger Things just made it known around the world. So I'm assuming now that there are children that are growing up and that is their folklore. And exactly what you just said is the case now.
When it comes to the film you made, based on how I've read and researched it, you spent, I think, more than 10 years working on that documentary, and you interviewed people who claim they were experimented on or they were taken by the government and experimented on. Tell me a little bit about that. Tell me about some of the stories that they shared and the details that they shared with you.
So when I started, there weren't many people interested in this subject. In fact, I was working on another project and I had friends tell me, don't do this because no one's going to really be interested in it. I said, listen, something's compelling me. And so I went directly to the source. I traveled to Al Bielek's home and I was in his backyard speaking to the man who started the story, went to Preston Nichols' home in upstate New York, spoke to him, spoke to Stuart Swerdlow, another person that was involved in this. I did speak to Duncan Cameron on the phone and tried to speak to everybody who supported this story as truth. And I just wanted to hear from them. I wasn't judging them. I wasn't putting them on the hot seat. I had questions and I allowed them to speak. I found some really interesting things, and I think nuance gives away a lot. And a lot of the things that Al and Preston talked about that I doubted back then, part of that, they were talking about assassins, mind-controlled assassins one way or another, that there would be suggestion put out, and that they would be triggered to go and do these horrible things that have been happening in abundance since. Everything from the UFO, UAP phenomena that's so prominent now and talked about in government circles to some great minds have said for, a century now that time travel could be possible one day, to the alien reverse engineering of alien technology, to artificial intelligence, doing things that we take for granted that were only in science fiction.
I do want to know, there are details of kidnapping, like you mentioned. What are some of those tales that those people shared with you? Like, what did that look like? What ages are we talking with? And what was the promise that they were kind of taken on?
All men that I spoke to back then suggested the same thing, that they were specifically looking for kids that wouldn't be missed, kids that were already missing. They knew there were an abundance of runaway kids on the street, even prostitutes, and they would find these kids and offer them some kind of stipend or simply just grab them under false pretenses and bring them to this base underneath Camp Hero. We spoke to people that were military there that said they were bringing people in and out of there. Each of those rooms were professionally painted with patterns that were similar to these drug experiments that we were able to prove. So in one wall, there would be a checkered pattern. On another wall, there would be a professionally painted paisley pattern. Clearly, this was not done by graffiti artists or people breaking into it and hanging out. This was professionally done, and it was done by people with intent. On top of that, when History Channel financed a sequel to Montauk Chronicles, The Dark Files, I had some resources that I never had before. We brought geophysicists to the base And they found something very curious that is worth discussing. I think it's the greatest piece of evidence to this day. They were able to see beneath the ground structures that are allegedly not there on record. And GeoView found iron ore, rebar, and enormous structures underneath the ground that would support the theory that there is an underground base. And I talked to a fisherman who saw things hovering in the sky around that area or claims to have seen them. Even the head of Chamber of Commerce, and I guess the mayor of Montauk at one point, said when he was in high school, he saw something hovering above that area. This is worth talking about. I think if they were to discover that any of this was true, it would be a big problem because, this is an enormous crime. And if the rest of the world found out, somebody has to answer for this, like Bill Clinton did in the 90s,
What was the intention with these childhood experiments? Was it similar to MK Ultra in that, that was something carried out by the CIA between the 50s and 70s? Like, what was the premise here? What was the motivation? What were they hoping to achieve?
Theoretically, what they were hoping to achieve was what they were hoping to achieve in some of these other projects, like the Holmesburg prison experiments, where Alan Hornblum confirmed that these were mind control experiments and they were testing to see if they could influence a human being with a trigger word or a sound or an image, that they would be an assassin. That's one thing. The other thing was they were using these children in all kinds of experiments. Time travel experiments where allegedly one of them was pushed through a portal and disappeared forever, or a lot of them. I've heard all of these stories and tried to document them and even question them to the best of my ability.
In terms of Stranger Things, I do want to know, in what ways does the show reflect the theory in a lot of ways? In what ways do you see the Montauk Project and the way that the people you interviewed speak about what went down under that airbase? How do we see that reflected in the show?
So from what I could see, the mind control programming, children being used, the kidnapping, the secret base, there's a lot. The monster from the id, because that's something that Preston Nichols claimed was possible, that the Montauk chair was an amplifier, that you could think of something and bring it into reality. At this point, I don't doubt anything to be impossible, because all we have to do is think of it and think of how to invent it. How do we manifest something physically into reality? I think there is a technology that is being developed that allegedly is going to be possible one day. What are they called? Foglets, that a computer can tell it what to form and it will form physically. So I wonder if the computer could read the mind and then form these things into something that's physical, or something that can communicate with our mind, and that we're in a complete and total matrix type situation. You won't be able to tell the difference. I think we're getting there. I think the AI is analyzing us. So Stranger Things is a reflection of a lot of what's said at Montauk, but also I was told many times over that the experiments at Montauk were not the only location, that they were literally around the world. And I've heard from people since then, and I wonder sometimes, I think I've heard from a combination of people that are considerable and others that have had some kind of trauma in life and feel more comfortable saying that the monster that I've dealt with, whatever it may be, whatever type of abuse that they cannot face, was because I was in this program. And then I read a lot about how we compensate for traumas in life, where a lot of people who say they were abducted by aliens may have been abused by a human, and that they just cannot face what was hurting them. So they replace it with a monster or an alien.
In terms of the way that officials and governments respond to this, is this something that you've escalated to government officials, and what reply and response have you gotten?
We have. And in some cases, speaking personally to certain people that were either in the CIA or worked for the government in high capacity, and said that, yes, there's worse than you think going on. And then we're told in the editing stages, this scene has to go. You can't put this in the show. For the Dark Files, specifically, there was an entire segment that we shot in Washington, D.C. And all of it was cut out. For instance, think about the Tuskegee medical experiments, where they were secretly giving, and this has been proven, by the way, they were giving men syphilis over the course of 10 years, lying to them, saying they were getting free health care, or things that happened in Nazi Germany, or things that happened around the world in so many different places where people were being experimented on, unbeknownst to them. So if you consider the nature of man and the evil and cold nature of government, you can't dismiss that it might be happening now. Look at the chaotic world we live in. Why is this important to know? Because it behooves the people that want to hurt us if we're asleep. If the Tuskegee medical experiments happened and the Holmesburg prison experiments happened, and they were proven to be mind control experiments, MKUltra, what makes you think that with the billions of dollars invested in these things over time, that all of a sudden they're just going to go away? No, this mind still exists. You don't want this to come to your door. And the solution isn't, let's go start a militia with a bunch of dudes in the woods and have shotguns. That's not going to do anything. We need to talk, because they could be happening. I know everyone's frustrated, but you're going to be even more frustrated if it comes to your door.
That was researcher and filmmaker Christopher Garetano speaking with me there. And that is it for this episode of The Briefing, the first ever episode of 2026. You are welcome, briefers. If you enjoyed this chat, or if you learned something new, or maybe, just maybe, your mind's been changed in any shape, way or form, leave us a comment, chuck us a DM, head to our socials and get in touch with us. We absolutely love hearing from you. That is it for this episode. Happy New Year, y'all.